So welcome back, everybody, to this exciting session in the afternoon. So my name is Dr. Hina. I'm the Executive Director for Space Scotland. And today what we're going to do is going to talk a little bit about the space sector and how that fits into both the innovation programme that we've been talking about and hearing so much about today, but also within a sustainability environment. And so I've got a wonderful panel that I'd like to introduce you to. And we're going to have a bit of a discussion, and then there'll be time for Q&A after that. So I work for an organisation called Space Scotland, where we support the space industry here in Scotland by providing resources in terms of engagement with city councils and with the government, and also the academic environment to allow our industries to flourish. We're also looking at where there are challenges within the sector and how we think about sustainability, innovation, technology development, and where the transitions are that we need to be focused on in order to make space a really focused key area for Scotland as we move forward. So I'm going to introduce our panel and then look forward to questions as we move forward.
Yeah, hi. So I'm Rosie and I work for Skyora. So for those of you that don't know, we are a company that design, manufacture and launch rockets. So we have two main vehicles. We have our suborbital vehicle called the Skylark L, and we actually had a launch attempt of that last year from Iceland. And then we have our main vehicle, which is our orbital vehicle. So it's a 3-stage vehicle that's going to be launching from the Shetland Islands at Saxonwood Spaceport in 2025. And it's going to be launching small satellites specifically. A little bit of context on myself. So I'm a senior business development associate at Skyora, and my job is a little bit of everything. So I do a bit of sales, a bit of managing clients, and I also do a lot of outreach like this, conferences, events, and also work with our technical team as well.
Thanks so much, Rosie. Paula.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to be here. My name's Paula, and I work for a company called Space Intelligence, and we're really pleased to be here to contribute to this conversation. Space Intelligence is essentially, we're a nature data company. So we use data from satellites to provide data sets for environmental monitoring, usually around forests and carbon. We have two main products. They are called Habitat and Carbon Mapper, and they are used by multiple different organisations within the nature-based solutions carbon market. My role there is project manager, and I'm currently responsible for managing all of the commercial work that comes to Space Intelligence. So we have a really varied list of clients, from large corporates all the way through to NGOs, and we have some innovation projects as well, which I'm hoping to talk about today. So yeah, that's me.
Thanks very much, Paula. And Celia.
Thanks, Hina. Hi, everyone. I'm going to try not to blind myself by looking at the lights directly, so that's why I'm looking over here. My name's Celia. I'm the co-founder and director of Omanos Analytics. So we're a downstream Earth observation data processing company, and we use satellite imagery to help solve human problems around the world. So we combine satellite data analysis with community narratives and participatory mapping, with the aim of identifying and monitoring social and environmental impacts around the world. And the idea is essentially that combining these two different data sources offers a much richer, much more comprehensive, and importantly, much more inclusive picture of what's happening on the ground, whether that's climate impacts or displacement of communities, or mining activities, or wildlife corridors, really a whole host of different applications. And we do this through two core technologies. So first, we have a smartphone app that allows communities to gather their own ground data. It's available in a number of different languages, uses a lot of icons, end-to-end encrypted for kind of more difficult locations. And then we also have a dashboard to visualize these different layers so that our customers, whether that is governments or NGOs or lawyers, researchers, other companies, to kind of explore the different stories that these different types of data can tell, both from space and from the ground. So yeah, looking forward to the discussion today.
Thanks very much. And so when we think about, the audience here may not have much of an understanding of what the space sector is, but, in Scotland we talk about space as there's a manufacturing capability. This morning and this afternoon it's been talked about that, we have building satellites. We've also got some rockets which are being developed. Some may have an idea that there's some space ports which are being developed in both the north and in the west of Scotland. But there's a whole other aspect to what the space industry is, and the innovation that's taking place is really significant, especially when you tie that into the kind of climate emergency that we're talking about today. So can we talk a little bit about, it'd be really interesting to hear, what are the kind of things that you're seeing within your industry, within your business, which you would see that accelerate innovation? Celia, I know you've just talked a little bit about some of the applications and tools that you're developing, but how are you seeing that innovation being accelerated through that organisation programme?
Yeah, it's such an important question, and I think for us there are a few different pieces that come into this. First of all, our team is very multidisciplinary. So my background is actually, it's not in space at all. It's not even really in tech. I spent the first decade of my career working in humanitarian development, working with independent media in some kind of complex locations, including Russia and Ukraine, and looking at data access from the kind of investigative journalism perspective and operational security kind of underpinning that. But other people on the team are software developers, astrophysics background, different sorts of security, space systems engineering. And I think our kind of internal innovation is one of the key drivers for that is just four very, very different brains kind of sitting around the table and coming at problems from completely different perspectives. And, one person saying that's absolutely never going to work in a million years, and then another person saying, oh, well, actually, I in my former life, I did this or X, Y, Z. In terms of the kind of external drivers, one thing we've really benefited from is partnerships with other kind of similar-sized SMEs in Scotland, and that can be through partnerships to deliver commercial work, or partnerships for programming with the European Space Agency, but kind of building those consortiums. And I think one of the gaps that has filled for us is not needing to do everything in-house, right? Like, it's when you're a small company, one of the things you have to be really disciplined about is just keeping focus and saying, well, do we need to build this from the ground up, or actually is that company over there already doing it? Can we subcontract them? Can we build a partnership? And it's, I think we'll kind of get to this, but it's that the complexity of that kind of ecosystem is balancing like healthy competition with partnership. And that's sometimes incredibly straightforward and sometimes, not actually. Yeah. And yeah, I think those partnerships more broadly with academia, we've worked with local authorities in the UK, and we have a number of international partnerships. And again, it's just the diversity of partnerships and the diversity of perspective that brings to any kind of product development that's been so helpful for us.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really important actually, because as you mentioned, the sector is growing. There's a lot of applications that you can see on a global scale. And so we need to try and think about, well, where is it that the individual companies are sitting? Where is the innovation that is really going to focus that and be cutting edge? And how do you include the other elements of the development that you need that perhaps are kind of a little bit away from where your core business is, and how we take advantage of the ecosystem as a whole? Paula, I don't know if there's been things like that you've found, obviously, within the kind of programmatical element of space intelligence, and how you've found that connection as well.
With accelerating innovation?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think to touch a little bit on what Celia was saying as well about the structure and the sort of skills that we have within space intelligence, it's fair to say that we have an incredible amount of PhDs. And that's coming out of the University of Edinburgh. Our founders are both University of Edinburgh. One of them is a professor from the geography department, one of the youngest professors of the university, and that expertise has really enabled us to have really innovative and market-leading products. But in terms of accelerating innovation, one of the things that we had this year, a specific example that I wanted to talk about, was actually a Can-Do Innovation project that was funded from the Can-Do Innovation Fund. So one of our products, which is Carbon Mapper, and this is essentially a mapping product that maps carbon stocks across forests at a per pixel level. So that's like a little tile within what a satellite will pick up. Currently, our target markets are in the tropics, and we're mostly supporting nature-based monitoring in tropical forests, but one of the emerging ones is the more northern, slightly higher latitude forests and sort of boreal temperate forests, coniferous forests. And the Can Do Innovation Fund that we access enabled us to do some innovation incorporating ISAT-2, which is a satellite that was launched by NASA in 2018, and it was actually designed to monitor the ice sheets and the height of the ice sheets, but it's also given us data on the topographic nature of the height of the trees, essentially. So through Can Do Innovation, we were able to trial that within our Carbon Mapper product, and it was successful. And now we actually have some new contracts looking at forests in the temperate zone. So we're sort of really delighted about that, and it's really helped to accelerate innovation within the company.
Yeah, and I think it is being able to access some of these forums and, you know, we have these conversations. I think this is a prime example, being able to have the discussion that, yes, there's lots of things which are very technical about space, but there's also things which are quite broad in the way that you apply that data and where the outputs can actually be generated. And as you say, you know, some of the data has been there for a long time. You know, 2018, you mentioned the NASA satellite, you know, it was there, the data is available to those people who can access it. And now having a technical expertise within a business, I think trying to do that is really important, as well as the products and services. Rosie, just kind of coming on to you, obviously you're working on the other end of the spectrum in terms of the rockets and you know, where there's future capability and capacity that we might want to access. In terms of what you've kind of seen both in accelerating innovation, but also in some of the changes that are happening within the industry, where do you see kind of Skyora and what's happening fit into that, and how do we move forward to make access of some of the new technologies that you're developing as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So I feel like I have 2 points to answer that question. So the first point is kind of going off what Paula and Celia have said, is sort of like how great collaboration is. And so something that we've done is we've developed our own 3D printer. It prints using metal powder and a laser and just sort of builds the product up like a normal 3D printer. It's called our Skyprint, and we're using that to print components for our rocket engines. But what we've also been doing is we've been working with a bunch of other companies, universities, and also research organizations to look into multi-material 3D printing using this printer, which is quite an innovative concept that hasn't actually been properly done yet. So we're trying to print with different materials, attaching them together, which is actually more complicated than it sounds. And then, of course, it'll hopefully make the actual rocket engine components lighter. So working with all these different range of companies and universities has been quite beneficial for us in terms of innovation, just because we are not just working with space companies, but we're also working with companies in like the aerospace industry, automotive, maybe even like the health industry. So there's a lot of different areas and sectors that we can like bring expertise in from that. So that's been quite a good project for us in terms of innovation. And then in terms of like the sort of wider space sector, our main goal is to open up access to space. So our orbital vehicle is going to be taking, like I said, small satellites to specifically low Earth orbit, which is the lowest orbit around the Earth. And hopefully, because we'll be based in the UK, it'll be much easier for those Scottish-based satellites and those UK-based satellites to actually send their satellites to space. And this is because typical rocket options are actually, the closest one is probably in America, so you probably have to go to either SpaceX or Rocket Lab to actually launch your satellite. And that's quite far to go, and you have to deal with export laws and things like that. Whereas if we had an opportunity in the UK to actually launch these satellites, it'd be much cheaper, much more efficient, and hopefully make research much more easier to access in that way.
And just sticking to that point a minute, I mean, that seems like, you know, that should be the way that we go. But do you see any challenges at the moment that you can think that are kind of not hindering, but are causing a little bit of, you know, kind of need to be unpicked as we move forward in order to get to that stage? Because, you know, who wouldn't want to be able to make their supply chain and access vehicles more easily accessible? But I fear that there's probably something else in there that perhaps we need to think about before we get to that point.
Yeah, absolutely. There are a few different challenges, but one I'd like to focus on mostly is, so in terms of like hiring staff for a rocket company, there aren't that many people with experience. So we can quite easily hire like graduates, and they're very well talented and things like that. But what we're also lacking is a lot of highly skilled staff with the experience that we need to do the more technical things. And I think that's something we've been struggling with a lot against those much larger companies, maybe like BAE or Boeing or companies like that, because for those highly skilled staff, they can pay a much higher salary than we can currently, just because we are still a small company, we're still scaling up. So I think that's something that is definitely a challenge for us right now. But I know that Space Scotland is doing a lot of different work, Hina, in terms of trying to fill different skills gaps, and we've been sort of inputting into that. But yeah, I think we definitely need to keep focusing on how we can sort of bring in those more highly skilled staff in different ways.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it's come up before today, the kind of skills programme, and it really needs to be kind of thought through more carefully. One of the things that I'm quite excited about, though, is trying to encourage our young people and people moving from other sectors into the space sector, is that there's something which they can see that there's a innovation happening for the good of the population, the global environment, and I suppose it's maybe how do we articulate that? How do we make that the focus? That yes, you're coming into a sector which is technically demanding and maybe needs a certain level of expertise, but actually the output that you're deriving is going to be more beneficial within the world where we work. And I don't know, Celia, if you've got examples that you can say, when we think about, what is it that's impacting from what you work that you're doing, how do we make that case to make it more visible that, the space sector is a broad environment and it's kind of inputting into a lot of different areas of social mobility and other things that would be useful.
Yeah, I mean, I think we set up as a kind of a social purpose business, really, with this mission to improve transparency around kind of land use and environmental impact and social impact of everything from large infrastructure projects to sort of things like mining concessions, that kind of thing. So our overall framing of this whole kind of problem is essentially, look, we have satellite data as this incredible asset. There's so much of it that's free. It's being hugely, hugely underutilized, particularly in sectors and in countries where the expertise around analysis might not be readily available. And so, yeah, part of our founding mission was, look, we can probably help as an intermediary in there. And then in terms of kind of building that awareness within the Scottish ecosystem, yeah, I mean, a good example is we worked really closely with the Human Geography Department at Glasgow University to develop a set of ethical ground data collection principles. And this was something that came out of work that Amanos did in Kenya, where we worked with Maasai tribesmen to map an area of land around a geothermal power plant. And the goal of that work was essentially to kind of, the Kenyan government has made a very laudable and ambitious commitment to go fully renewable by 2030. And it's had a lot of international investment to support that, but some of that investment has actually kind of been pulled out because of social and environmental harms that have kind of resulted along the way. So the aim really here was to inject Earth observation analysis into the overall environmental and social impact assessment to provide a kind of more rigorous and more regular monitoring function to kind of forecast and mitigate against the risk of community displacement, that kind of thing. So what we were doing with this group of Maasai was mapping existing geothermal plants, the areas around them, to look at what the social and environmental impact had been, and then using predictive modeling to forecast what that risk might look like in some of the newer plants. And sorry, that's a whole bunch of background to the ethical data point, because in our, just the negotiations with this group to say, right, what does this look like? Actually a really critical thing for them. They were like, who owns the data? We're going to gather all this data. We're going to interview all of these village elders. We're going to be taking water samples. We're going to be taking soil samples. We're going to be monitoring air pollution. We're going to be taking photos. We need to have co-ownership of that data. And, as soon as they said it, I was like, yeah, of course, that makes a ton of sense, absolutely. But also, this needs to be a core principle for all of the work that we're doing. And also, there are absolutely other groups, whether it's universities doing field work, whether it's other companies. So we put together a set of kind of ethical data principles that drew on other domains, but there's not that much out there for kind of for our specific industry. again, worked with the Human Geography Department, PhD students there, and so those are now up on our website. But I think for us, a lot of that building awareness has been through partnerships and then open sourcing what we can, really, with the hope of other people picking that up and running with it.
Yeah, and I think it is that, you know, it's finding those connections, you know, those things that you have developed, but then actually seeing, well, there's some work that can be done very, you know, here and now with this data, but actually by opening it out and providing it to other people that then are able to think of other innovations and other technologies that might be useful in that. Paul, I don't know if you want to come in as well on that side in terms of the kind of the biomass products that you're developing at Space Intelligence and how that's kind of, you're seeing that innovation making a kind of impact for the world and how we make things better.
Yeah, no, I think the innovation for good concept is a really relevant one to Space Intelligence. In fact, I think it underpins the ethos of the building of the whole business. I mean, I think many people know, and we've spoken about it, it's been spoken about in the conversations today, that climate change is one of the defining challenges of our time. And everyone is a stakeholder in that internationally. But of course, there are people living in the global south or even, you know, in other remote communities that are going to be affected more quickly by the impacts of climate change. Deforestation remains a big challenge. We're still losing around 10 million hectares of forest per year. We're still deforesting for commodity production, and the Space Intelligence products, well, the way that the market is responding to that internationally is that a lot of these companies now are obviously being forced to count their greenhouse gas emissions, and therefore they're creating targets for decarbonisation. Usually around 75% mark is what a lot of them are aiming for between 2030 and 2050, the big ones anyway. But there's a final 25% which is left for what they call carbon removals. And one of our most, I guess, promising ways of doing that is to do it through conserving forests and planting new forests. And that is exactly what the Space Intelligence products, which is Carbon and Habitat Mapper, which are using machine learning tools and combining data from satellites. That's exactly what we're using that to do. And the idea there is to get this data into the hands of the large corporates that need it to make these kind of investments. It's fair to say that they're really significant financial transactions, actually, in a lot of cases. And the ultimate aim that's driving those corporations is that greenhouse gas emission number, so essentially their carbon number. But the actual whole benefit of being able to provide the evidence to make that transaction happen can translate, I think, well beyond just the carbon benefit, and that's when you start to see finance being unlocked to go to some of, you know, essentially the poorest communities in the world, to be able to have better access to education. We've seen some of the carbon projects through the standards like Vera have been, you know, improving education, poverty alleviation, inclusion of women, participatory approaches to these projects, and ultimately I think it's helping to understand that carbon increase in forests there's a lot that has to go in to make that happen that's social. You know, you have to have social change before you can actually realise a carbon benefit, and I think we're proud as a company to be supporting corporates to be able to be confident that they're putting their money towards investments that will have carbon benefit, but also the indirect benefits that creates for the communities that need it.
Yeah, it's that kind of like, why does it matter in the first place kind of question.
Yeah. And I think, you know, your point is really interesting. You know, when you think about these large corporates, which are, like you say, it's huge financial sums that they're having to, you know, kind of consider when they're making these changes, and also having to verify some of the controls that they have in place, and how are they monitoring these things, and where does that data come from? How do we make sure that they're getting the accurate information so that then they can make the relevant regulatory and reporting requirements that they're having to do? And within Space Scotland, we're seeing that as well within, you know, the financial services sector, but also other sectors where there's now a kind of mandatory element of reporting and confidence that is needed in order to verify some of these claims. And I think, you know, it's really interesting to hear you say that that's work that you've been involved in. So we've got some loads of questions coming in thick and fast on Slido, but just before we go to them, I just wanted to touch very briefly on, you know, obviously we talk about the summit here, but also we're in Glasgow, we're in Scotland. How is it that we want to, you know, could you see from your perspectives within the Scottish ecosystem, you know, what is it that is needed, the support that's there, is there something that's lacking? How do we build an environment which can both grow the space sector, but also provide the avenues of engagement, which we've talked about here, so that then people have an understanding of how space is relevant and where the data can be used in a variety of different ways. So I'll start with you, Rosie, and then we'll go into questions.
Yeah, of course. I think I'd say the first point is that in Scotland, the space sector is very, very collaborative and very friendly. So maybe if you're thinking about trying to get into the space sector a little bit, just ask probably any of us, and I'm sure we'd be willing to help. And then aside from that, yeah, I guess just like sort of more, we focus a lot on like STEM outreach and things like that. So just trying to like let the sort of local areas know. So just about like what's going on in the space sector. So yeah.
Paul?
Yeah, I think the most special thing about Scotland is that we've got upstream to downstream capability. And I think I'm not exactly sure on the exact how in terms of, you know, government mechanisms, but I think companies could probably feed each other quite a lot more. You know, we've worked together in the past, and you know, even things around, you know, we're using data from the satellites from NASA, some of the sensors from NASA, but as we go forward, you know, there's probably things that we can feed into things like companies like Clydespace who are making small sats and new sensors and building enhanced, you know, actually feeding each other up and down that stream. Because I think in some ways, I'm not sure I've seen too much of it, but you know, we really do have that capability as a country to sort of come together. And the way of doing that, how that happens, I'm not entirely sure, but the opportunity is there.
Definitely. Celia?
Yeah, I think you're bang on, Paula. I think there's what's kind of particular about Scotland is, it's the end-to-end capability, and so it's the end-to-end service offering. And so where I can see really useful investment is in facilitating relationships between, I like the way you put it, like organizations that can feed each other. I think, you know, we kind of joked earlier about like, oh, well, sometimes competition is about, you know, people being worried you're going to eat their lunch, but like maybe that's building on that metaphor, like we can, you know, we can contract out work and we can receive subcontracts. I think there's a lot there that creating the right incentives could be really valuable. Buying data, you know, at kind of a reduced rate, like all of those sorts of things. And I think that kind of moves Scotland towards this place of having a bit more of a mesh network where there are just companies of a number of different sizes with different specialisms up and down that pipeline. And I think this approach would help us kind of invest equally in those different sort of areas of expertise. I think the other thing I would add is a lot of the companies working in Scotland have a really international outlook. And I think a lot more focus needs to be put on developing the international market. Obviously, it's a little bit complex in some areas because it's not devolved matter. But, you know, again, we were talking earlier, there are kind of ways around that. And I think, that international outlook is something very particular and very special.
Yeah, and I would totally agree with that. I think, you know, the kind of global market, you know, space is a global commodity. It's not bounded by traditional geographical boundaries, and, you know, the heritage that we have across an academic is world leading and it is universal. And so accessing that and then providing a forum within which, you know, the company can start to export, but also start to demonstrate a value that Scotland has, I think is really important. So just going through some of the questions, you've got Slido up there if anybody is keen to ask some questions. I'm just going to go through a few here. One really interesting one, just picking up, but it's come from, how soon will it be until we see a Scottish satellite built for a Scottish data client launched on a Scottish rocket, launched on a Scottish-built rocket, launched from a Scottish spaceport? Wow. Rosie, I'm going to take that one to you.
Yeah, of course. All being well, hopefully 2025 from SACS Award, and then hopefully beyond that, maybe 2 or 3 rockets a year. So yeah, hopefully very soon.
So that covers the launch part. I'll cover the Scottish built part. So Scottish satellites are being built already, not very far from here. In fact, I think to date there's probably over 150 satellites that have been built here in Glasgow, but more so across the whole of Scotland. But for a Scottish data client, I don't know if Paula, you want to take that, or Celia?
Well, we have one.
Okay.
So Nature Scot is one of ours, and we do the national land cover maps for Nature Scot, and the data is made publicly available. So I think there might be more clients in Scotland than what we might know. Hopefully there are, anyway. But it would be good, I think, well, we're looking to, we want to continue to provide that, and also to, it could be expanded. I think we've got a really excellent, in this particular example, a really highly classified map, which means basically it's just got a lot of detail about the different land classes. And I'm not exactly sure how it compares to England and Ireland and Wales, but potentially, there's ways that it could be expanded, and we want to definitely keep providing those things. There's also an opportunity with the Woodland Carbon Code, with the UK Woodland Carbon Code, and providing more services in that. But yeah, so far our market's been more in the tropics.
Celia, anything to add on that?
I mean, kind of similarly, we've also done a bit of work for Nature Scot. We also work with estate managers up in the Highlands to do things like wildlife monitoring and counting, kind of peatland monitoring. It's smaller scale than our international work, but it is also, a lot of the work that we've done in Scotland has provided the launch pad for, stuff that we've then been able to trial over a much larger area in places like Indonesia, Turkmenistan, Kenya. So I think, the foothold is there, and there's a ton of potential to expand that.
I think I'll just add as well that I think it's clear, and hopefully you'll agree, the audience, is that all the different elements of that question are done in Scotland. I think coming back to what Paula and Celia were saying, it's how do we connect all of those elements up? So satellites are being built in Scotland. There are launch vehicles being built in Scotland. There is a Scottish data spaceport which is being developed. There are data clients. But how do we bring it all together to actually solve an inherent or kind of national problem that we want to see as a leading light within Scotland to take globally? I think that would be transformational, and I'll leave that out there for some of our political colleagues who may be watching to kind of answer that.
I'd maybe add, if I may, add one final point to that, is some of solving that problem is around awareness. It's saying there are existing problems here, something like waste management, for example, that satellite data can be used to solve, but that awareness isn't actually quite out there. For example, at the sort of local authority, local council level. And that's something we as an industry, in partnership with government, need to get a bit better at doing, is there are so many different stakeholders that can be part of this and that can kind of drive that forward.
Yeah, no, I think I would agree with you on that. One of the other things that we've got here. So what are the biggest challenges that are holding back the growth of the sector, and what can we do to address these? Who wants to take that one first? Otherwise, I'm going to look at Paula.
I think it's kind of just, I'm going to say in advance, I think it's specific company by company. I feel I can only really talk, because we're in quite different markets. I think for us, because we are providing nature data mainly for the carbon markets at the moment, in a sense, the carbon market, it's voluntary still, it's limited by growth in itself. It is voluntary. There are some that are coming towards being regulated, but as it is currently in that state, it's in a state of flux, and I'm sure some of you might have seen, if you're interested in these things, it's come under a lot of scrutiny. There's been a lot of criticism of the carbon markets and the integrity around the credits. I think potentially the UK and the Scottish government, or we could engage more in those kind of narratives, and partnering and to provide solutions for different countries and those kind of things, connecting more with the end users. And I think that's especially for a downstream company, partnering with the end users that are usually quite far away from space is usually, not literally, figuratively. That's the kind of thing that we have to do a lot of, is finding the customers and translating what the space data does into what the value is for them. Yeah. So those partnerships really help.
So I think it just goes back to, Celia, what you were saying is that awareness, that building, one of the biggest challenges is, people have a preconceived ideas what they think is space and what they think it means, and most people will think, it's got nothing to do with me, I don't really have any, there's nothing in my business that is going to be useful or that could benefit from the use of space data. But actually, the reality is there probably is in pretty much everybody's business, so building that awareness. Moving on. What innovations are being developed to ensure, this is one for you, Rosie, to ensure near Earth orbit is sustainable by being junk-free and debris-free?
Nice. Yeah, that's a good question. So obviously, some of you might know there's quite a lot of space debris floating around in low Earth orbit, and as it grows, it's going to quickly become an issue. So what we're trying to develop in the future is our space tug. So if I give you a bit of context about our orbital vehicle, it's a 3-stage vehicle, and the 3rd stage has a reignitable engine, which means it can maneuver in orbit. And so what we're going to do to this 3rd stage is adapt it a little bit, add a robotic arm, maybe add other different modules so that it can then also be used as our space tug, which is going to service space debris in low Earth orbit. So hopefully it'll be able to deorbit space debris, so maybe bring it back down to the Earth's atmosphere and it'll burn up, or maybe you might even be able to refuel old satellites, or maybe taxi satellites to a more useful orbit. So that's sort of something that we're looking into for the future for us.
Yeah, and I think one of the things to add in there, that some of the work that, a lot of the early work that was done with Space Scotland, but also in partnership with industry and government, was to think about what sustainability within the space domain, as well as on the Earth, and how the industry is developing. How do we develop that? How do we look at that whole roadmap of activity? So the kind of the space sustainability roadmap was launched in 2021, and I think Skyora were part of those initial conversations, where how do we start to think about and be more mindful on what that means for a sector. So yes, there is space debris out there, but we need to be aware of both awareness of where it is, and that can be done by monitoring, but then how do we ensure that the tools and applications that we're developing kind of help make sure that it doesn't augment or kind of compound that effect. There's also a lot of work being done across the sector in the UK in kind of in-orbit manufacturing and things like that, so there's a lot of different things on that. I don't know if any of you want to, either of you kind of talk a little bit about that. Okay. This is an interesting one. If we were to all start from scratch, what things do you wish you'd known earlier and would have helped ventures move more smoothly? Kind of comes back to your own experiences and in terms of what you know today. Would you have done things differently or the same, or what might have helped? What would you have liked to have known beforehand that would have helped smooth the journey a little bit? I'm going to ask Celia first.
Everything takes twice as long as you think it's going to take.
That's a good point.
I think one reflection, this is a really good question. It makes me reflect, like, actually some of the challenges that we faced at the very beginning wouldn't be challenges if we were starting right now. Mm-hmm. So Paula and I were talking earlier about the value of community data, about talking to communities to verify what we see in the satellite data. What is that telling us? Does it actually make sense? Is it borne out by community testimony, by participatory mapping, by different sorts of soil, air, water samples, whatever? I think partly actually this was as a result of the pandemic. All of a sudden remote monitoring got a little turbo boost because we couldn't go anywhere. And in conversations now, I see much, much more focus on the ground truthing element. But when we started, I had to do a really hard sell for why that mattered. Like, why is it worth talking to people? Why does it matter what they say? And now it just doesn't take as long to make that point. Either people totally already get it, or you say a couple of things and they're like, oh yeah, sure, that makes sense.
Paula, anything from your experience that you think would have been different, or you'd see things changing within your environment that you might have done differently?
Well, I think mine comes more from the market side of who we sell to. Well, the thing, it goes back to what we were talking about, particularly in the carbon markets, for example. The innovation that we're doing, especially like Space Intelligence's products, we provide Carbon Mapper, which is literally what is your carbon benefit. But there's a lot of lessons learned that come out of that in terms of how the market decides to move forward, and we're starting to see acknowledgement. And I think it's learning's beyond even beyond our company, but about the requirement for understanding, in a sense, social change before something like carbon change can become real. Because ultimately, the things that are driving trees to be cut down tend to be a requirement for income for farmers, or it can be illegal logging, and ultimately it's coming from social and economic factors. So there's whilst our product fits into the carbon side of it, there's also this element of keeping up with the market. And I think that, I think we do a good job of doing that. I'm not sure if there's what we would do differently, but I think it's just making sure that we, that we pull that into our development and understanding of how things will change and shift as we move forward, the priorities as they change. But I think we try our best to keep our finger on the pulse of what's happening in the markets that we're working in.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good answer. I think the world has changed. I think everybody can recognise that, either through the pandemic or through an awareness of what we're doing on the planet. And so having a little bit more of an awareness from a social point of view, I think, is really significant, because ultimately, popular demand will drive a lot of the markets, and we've seen that happen time and time again. So if there's a social movement which is driving through, that's going to make the corporates move their direction, and that ultimately means that we need to have access to, we need to be able to facilitate that in a way forward. Rosie, one thing we didn't get onto in our questions, but questions come in on the fuel that you're using for your rockets. So there's two questions, but one was on, is it powered by liquid oxygen, and how would it be delivered to Saxavord? And then a second question is, would there be an interest to produce green hydrogen or oxygen on site?
So our rockets, they use kerosene and high test peroxide. So it's about 6 parts high test peroxide, 1 part kerosene. So in terms of the environmental effects of that, I would say that the high test peroxide, whenever it's burned, it mostly just releases oxygen and steam, so it's not necessarily releasing any carbon emissions. But obviously, whenever you burn your kerosene, it is releasing carbon. So something that we've been looking at is a more sustainable alternative, which we're calling ecocene. So some of our engineers have been looking into developing rocket-grade fuel from unrecyclable waste plastics. So we can take this plastic that you can't use anywhere else, it just goes to landfill. It goes through a chemical process, and then we can get different types of fuel, but one of those is rocket-grade kerosene, which we use for our launch vehicles, and then we can also get diesel and petrol and other fuels like that. So in the future, once we've sort of finished the development of that, we're hoping to use that in our launch vehicles as well. But yeah, in terms of bringing things to the launch site, I think it's a bit easier because kerosene and high test peroxide are stable at sort of normal temperatures, so there's not much of an issue there with that.
Fantastic. I think that's a really important point, actually, is that how do we, obviously rockets, and we want to make sure that fuel, again, coming back to that sustainable, that green agenda, and making sure that it's not detrimental. We've only got a few minutes left, and there's been quite a few questions on the skills side, so I'll kind of collate them all together, and it'd be great I think we've got quite a diverse within domains that we've got on the panel to get people's views. So first of all, is there a particular degree that maybe candidates would be useful for an ideal candidate to get into the sector? And then other questions around, if people with limited technical expertise, what's the best way to get into the space industry as a whole? So I'll start with Celia at the end, obviously, I think what you mentioned.
I mean, my degrees are in English and in law, so take from that what you will. But no, I mean, one thing I've noticed in the kind of recruitment pipeline is, again, a big shift in the last 4 years. So I think things like there's now an MSc at Strathclyde that we kind of helped feed into the development of that's actually kind of specifically does a lot around satellite data analysis. In terms of specific skill sets for us, it tends to be, can you analyze data? Can you analyze visual data? Software development. So also backgrounds in physics tend to be very, very useful. People with non-technical backgrounds, I think, yes, it just means you're approaching the problem from a different side. So, a lot of my time is spent looking at different ways that data can be used to solve problems. So I might not necessarily be sitting and figuring out which methodology to use and problem solving from that side. That's what my team is doing. But I am talking to different partners and saying like, oh, right, okay. You think there are secret prisons in the Turkmen Desert. Okay, yeah, I can think of a whole bunch of proxy indicators that we could use to identify that. So it's probably more on the identifying application side of things. And human geographers, lawyers, people with development backgrounds, I think if you're interested and kind of like hungry to learn, I think there's absolutely a place for those people in the industry.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Paul?
Yeah, from a downstream space company like Space Intelligence, I mean, I'm a geography MA, but as I said earlier, we've got a lot of PhDs. The main requirements, we've got quite a few astrophysicists, We've got quite a few ecologists as well for looking at forests in different countries. That's really important for us to have people that have ecological understanding across the globe. And then we've also got, but I totally echo what you're saying, you know, that, I mean, I'm a non-technical person and can't code and can't do any machine learning. But nevertheless, we need, especially for the downstream space companies, I think it's the people that can do the translation of that, because the rest of the world sometimes can't do that either. So, you know, I think definitely multidisciplinary, don't be put off if you don't have a technical degree. It's more than, you can actually create great things even without having a technical degree in terms of space applications, I think, for sure.
Yeah, totally agree.
Rosie.
Yeah, I think something it would be good to be aware about is the fact that in the space sector, we're still just kind of like normal companies. So we still need like security staff, HR staff, we need a business team, a legal team, as well as our technical team. So we're not just only hiring like engineers and that's it. So obviously if you want to be a rocket engineer, you probably need a degree in like aerospace engineering, mechanical engineering, something like that. But my degree was actually in planetary science and now I'm in business. So there is always like a bit of leeway for actually transferring to a different sector than to what you actually studied in university. So I think just keeping both of those factors in mind is really good whenever you're thinking about the space sector.
Yeah, I think that's a good point to end on. And also, you know, the question was on non-technical skills. I think you're also looking for people who perhaps don't necessarily have a degree and have, you know, kind of more practical skills. And I think that's a really important part. So unfortunately, we're out of time. So thank you very much for all the questions. Unfortunately, we didn't get through all of them. I did try my best. But I'd like to thank the panellists, Celia, Paula and Rosie, for your time here today. And I hope you found this enlightening and interesting in terms of what's happening in the space sector here in Scotland. Thank you.